what strategies are needed to overcome funding challenges and accelerate the hydrogen economy's role in achieving decarbonisation and eventually our net zero targets?
Well, that's the universal question, isn't it? I guess. Um, I think as an investment banker, I'm trying to support these early stage technology companies in getting to commercial scale by helping them raise equity. I think when they get to the point where they're ready to do project financing, I think whether it's the US or Europe, the incentives, such as the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits in the US, such as the revenue certainty mechanism and contract for differences approach in the UK and perhaps elsewhere in Europe. I think those are tremendously important. Any decarbonization of an industry needs some sort of incentive mechanism. If I go back in my career, this is one last final point. When I got involved in biofuels initially, seemed like a great idea because it was decarbonizing the fuel sector. But ultimately, we had to put in place in the US the renewable fuel standard. And then on top of that, the low carbon fuel standard that got adopted ultimately in most of the states in the US. And without those incentives, the history would have been quite different in terms of the scale up of biofuels and later SAF, sustainable aviation fuels. So we need these incentives. I'll give one last quick anecdote. I was asked to give a presentation to the UK Jet Zero Council last year on first commercial scale project financing. And I spoke with Philip New, the former head of biofuels at British Petroleum, who was the one who came up with the contract for differences revenue certainty mechanism, ultimately, along with the rest of the colleagues at the UK Jet Zero Council. But I thought that was really a great idea. And so I think Europe and the UK are sort of light years ahead of the US in terms of optionality and different approaches to incentivizing these projects. And particularly under the Trump administration, we're not seeing any incentives at all. And we're waiting to see whether the Congress is even going to refund the Inflation Reduction Act tax credits like Section 45, Z, V, et cetera, for fuels like hydrogen and SAF.
Thanks, John. And Matt, I'm going to come to you next. What needs to happen next? How do we continue to accelerate in hydrogen and reach those decarbonisation and net zero goals?
Look, I think you've got to decide where we are politically, globally, not just in the US. That the political movement is you can see it turning on the news every day, and the messaging that's coming out. I don't think the fundamentals have changed. We should still be looking at climate change as a almost like we're on a war footing. We need to be thinking of it that way, and I think that in order to unlock these markets and to pump prime these markets and to provide the carbon reduction levels that we require and supply certainty that we require, it is going to need government intervention. And I think that probably needs to be more inventive and probably more intrusive than we've seen before. We talked earlier about hydrogen pipelines and things like that. Governments should be putting these mechanisms in place to unlock these industries. We can't wait just for the market to come along, because we've talked today about, the market will invest in the right projects, but, it needs something that's overarching this and to pump prime that investment. So I think something a little bit more radical might be required to really get this market moving at the pace we need it to move at. And you look at, let's say, the nuclear industry in the UK, how the government is sitting behind that, underwriting it, and really getting that it's not just being left to the private sector. I think an approach like that's merited and warranted in clean energy generally. So I think some more innovation and some, I guess, a few more daring governments out there to really throw their weight behind some of these projects would be great.
Thank you, Matt. And finally, Adam.
I'm going to very much echo what Matt said. One word: innovation. I think energy has always been massively interconnected and really quite complex. I've always wondered if you could pitch to an investor today the oil industry, if nobody had seen it before. You take this thick black fluid out of the ground, and you can't just use it as it comes out of the ground. You've got to do stuff with it, and then you get multiple products that you're selling to multiple streams of multiple risks. I think you need to not just think about hydrogen, think about how it's connected. If you start thinking about hydrogen, you've got to start thinking about the power industry and how you're buying your power. Think about other offtakes. Think about, can you sell oxygen? And don't just accept what's been done before. And that applies to everybody, but us as advisors, to investors, to project developers and project sponsors. Look for different ways to do things, because I think there's always opportunity. We are faced with a difficult world, but within it there's going to be opportunities, and I think go out and find them.